refuting the claim that capital punishment is unconstitutional and too expensive. The claim of facts presenter stated that the death penalty is unconstitutional because it violates the 8th and 14th Amendment. He also stated that inmates on death row should face life in prison rather than be sentenced to death, and that the death penalty is simply too expensive. I, on the other hand, will argue that capital punishment is constitutional and is inexpensive. For my claims, to aid my claims, I will use the claims that the death penalty is safeguarded by decisions of the Supreme Court, and that the death penalty is actually inexpensive in comparison. In my first claim, where the death penalty is safeguarded by decisions of the Supreme Court, in this point, my opponent didn't really cite much evidence in that regard, but if we take a look at the court case, Furman v. Georgia of 1972, the court stated that those specific laws were indeed in violation of the 8th Amendment. But 4 years later, in the court case Gregg v. Georgia, the Supreme Court made a precedent by stating that the death penalty isn't per se unconstitutional, but as it serves some social retribution. And as recently as 2008, the court case Bays v. Rees stated that lethal injection, which is a common form of execution in many states, is not considered in the eyes of the court as criminal punishment, and thus does not violate the 8th Amendment. The presenter goes at length throughout his presentation to state the argument that life in prison is a better lesson to be taught to those who commit crimes. But on the flip side, the same thing could be said about the death penalty, and that leads me to my second point, that the death penalty is inexpensive. At this point there is a vast amount of information, and upon my research I found that monetarily the death penalty does present some advantages. It is more expensive than, say, someone who was given a life sentence and was living out their crime that way. But I think that this is where the greatest oversight from my presenter comes in. Even though, if we look at an article in 2014 from the San Diego Union Tribune, more than 2,000 inmates who had been given life sentences have been released in the past 5 years. In other words, it's a trend that even though these people committed crimes and through a jury they were given a life sentence, within a few years they were going to be let go, and that criteria is becoming more expansive, and more people are being allowed on parole. And so this is where I challenge my opponent in the sense that if his viewpoint is that life in prison is the ultimate lesson to be learned, rather than saying that the death penalty is another lesson. I argue that even though capital punishment is more expensive, I would argue that what price does the safety of innocent people have? If these people, even though they're given life sentences, and eventually they'll be able to come back to society, what price do the safety of innocent people have? So ultimately, I would like to conclude that the Constitution can be interpreted in many ways, and thus its amendments can be as well. And there is no defining case that sets whether capital punishment is constitutional or not. But I would argue that it does lie within the Constitution, and that it's inexpensive, and that capital punishment is inexpensive in the form of the effect it could have on people who are going through the death penalty.
All right, Isabella, your argument basically is going to be arguing contradictory positions to the advocate's point on two issues, one on whether or not it's constitutional and one on whether it's expensive. On the constitutional issue, I think you point out that the advocate fails to cite any evidence. I think you should explain a little bit what their reasoning was in this particular situation, why the lack of evidence doesn't support that particular reasoning. You do cite the one case that overturned the death sentences at one point, but then you've got two other cases subsequently that show that it is perceived as being within the law and acceptable under the Constitution, which makes that last argument that you make where this is there isn't any defining case that defines as constitutional seem confusing, because I think you cited two cases, one in 2008 and one even later than that, concerning lethal injections that do exactly that. So I think you could be a little bit more forceful in your argument on that particular point. The advocate makes the argument about life being a better alternative, and you need to make I know you're there somewhere. Where are you? There you are. You need to make the declarative statement that says life imprisonment doesn't mean life imprisonment, and it never has. And here's some examples. I think you have a good piece of information from the newspaper in San Diego about 2,000 inmates being released. So that's 2,000 people who were once sentenced to life imprisonment who are being released back into the population. So that's a good argument. It's a good start of an argument. Do you have any evidence on recidivism of murderers, of people who've been sentenced to crimes like this before? If you've got a couple of examples of people who were sentenced to life but then were released subsequently and then they committed further crimes, that would make your argument a lot more persuasive. And I think that then your argument about public safety and how there's a price or a value to be put on that makes a little bit more sense. You never directly confront the cost issues other than that. And since you haven't really developed the second part of that argument, I think that undermines your position there a little bit. I think you've got the stronger position on the constitutionality issue. I think you've got a good argument on the second point, but it's a little bit underdeveloped. All right. Thank you.